Right, so first of all, I wanted to thank Florian, but also Professor Rieger for the invitation. My great honor to be here today. And also I would like to congratulate you of having this opportunity to develop such a wonderful project. So I was invited by Florian a couple of months ago to give a talk on plurality. And at the time I was a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. And I thought that I understood what he meant by plurality, so I immediately said, okay, and I give him a title. But 3 days ago, I became so panicked. I feel that my talk is not relevant, probably not relevant at all. But after having heard Professor Rieger's introduction, I think that maybe it's not completely irrelevant, and I hope that you can see the relevance in its irrelevance. So when I was proposing the talk, I was engaging with colleagues at the University of Tokyo who has been dedicated more than a decade on a program, on research program on coexistence. And I was very much struck by the fact that they translate the Japanese word kyose, which means coexistence, into symbiosis. I was very struck by that. So my talk is related to this experience. But let me start and try to make my talk relevant to the whole theme of the virtual world. So the organizer of the conferences invites us to, and I quote here, to detach the concept of virtuality from its rigid opposition to reality in order to circumvent the concomitant charges of the virtual as the extraordinary, otherworldly, and unreal. So the virtuality here is no longer thought as that which is opposed to the actual, a pair that became popular around the 1990s, as Florian says, referring to the online and the offline world. But this difference today could be easily understood as a difference between the morning star and the evening star. If you remember what Frege says in Sinn und Bedeutung, that morning star and evening star all refers to the same star. So, but the organizers ask us to reflect on the virtuality as extraordinary, otherworldly, unreal, in contrast to the ordinary, worldly, and real. In other words, here virtuality stands as a kind of transcendence, but without God. Then how can we understand this concept of virtuality? Is it possible to conceive an epistemology of virtuality? Or the virtuality that we are discussing is already made intelligible by a particular epistemology which we don't really look at it in this way. So maybe we can keep these two questions in mind for the moment while we dive into the question of plurality that this panel is dedicated to. Now, I interpret the relation between virtuality and plurality in the following ways. Virtuality as a generative power which cannot be reduced to any homogeneity, always resist homogenization or resist being paradoxically reduced to a pluralism based on monism. So there's a paradox, because we can talk about plurality based on monism, but we can also talk about a pluralism that is irreducible to any monism. So virtuality is here understood both as the generative power which produces plurality, so we can understand it from the perspective of ontology, but also it is that which makes coexistence of plurality possible. Now, if we only talk about multiplicity, but without talking about the coexistence of plurality, then we still miss something. That is what I wanted to address. Now, how could this plurality and coexistence be addressed, especially in the context of the study of media and technology? As I said before, when I was at the University of Tokyo's colleagues have been working a lot on this question of coexistence because it is pressing, because the process of the planetarization in the past centuries has brought about, firstly, the ecological crisis, and secondly, now an actual geopolitical reality based on intensive military competition and technological acceleration. In the past century, biological metaphors have been employed to describe modes of existence between different worlds. For example, we heard of terms such as symbiosis, symbiosis, organicism, which are actually at the base of what Professor Riegel just mentioned about Lebenswert, or in the work of von Risku. Now, these terms originated from biology, designating the constitution of the whole by parts and how different parts related to each other by forming reciprocal relations. And it has become a paradigm of thinking or an image of thought in the 20th century. And it is against this biological metaphor that I would like to start to proceed to my talk, and in order to resituate the question of virtuality against this biological metaphor. So the first, I have basically three parts, but actually the last part is very short. So basically two parts. The first part is on the organic condition of philosophy. And let me start with this quote by Immanuel Kant, the pre-critical Kant. It is astonishing that something like an animal body should even be possible. The organismic metaphor culminated in the first half of the 20th century, which we can find among philosophers such as Henri Bergson, Alfred North Whitehead, historians such as Louis Mumford and Joseph Needham, among many others. In the East, some philosophers also identified organicism with Eastern thinking in China as well as in Japan. For example, one of the philosophers of the Kyoto school, Miki Kiyoshi, and he has published a book called The Philosophy of Technology in the 1930s, one of the earliest. That in this book he proposed to overcome the decadence of technological culture, in a way like how Husserl talked about the Lebenswert, by going back to what he called the traditional Japanese spirit. And he called this spirit organismus, which is the transcription of the German word. However, I would like to suggest that this organismic metaphor, which used to describe the Lebenswert, but also as something against the technological, the process of Technisierung, might lose its significance today, and this event is not simply an accident, but rather it's also a turning point which pushes us to rethink the task of philosophy and to reflect on the question of plurality and its coexistence of plural world. Now, I would like to make a claim. I want to make two claims in this talk, and the first claim is that the opposition between mechanism and organism characterized the development of modern philosophy. In other words, this opposition is the foundation or the grounding of modern philosophy. The key to this is Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment. In my book, Recursivity and Contingency, published in 2019, I claimed that it was Immanuel Kant who has laid out this organic condition of philosophizing, and I have tried to show why it was so, and how the post-Kantian idealists, such as Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, were nurtured by this organic condition of philosophizing, and departing from there to develop their own systems. So the organic condition of philosophizing means that for philosophy to be, it has to become organic. It has to address the question of the irreducibility of life to mechanism. Now, Kant's understanding of organic is largely spelled out in the Critique of Judgments, as most of you know. The book was divided into two parts: aesthetic judgment, which concerns the beautiful and the sublime, and technological judgment, which concerns organism and the natural end. These two judgments rest on a specific operation and structure, namely reflective judgment. Unlike the determinative judgment, which functions mechanically by subsuming the particulars to the universal, a reflective judgment, in the contrary, does not subsume the particular to the universal, but rather attempt to derive its own rules from the particular on its way towards the universal. So we start from the particular and then it works reflective towards the universal. Well, this is like what we can think about machine learning today. A reflective judgment is that which open to contingency, which is necessary for its own determination by going back to itself, as you can see on this different form of recursive structure. This circular movement is not a mere repetition from A, B, C to A and then back again, but rather what I call recursive. It designates a new operation and a new structure, where you can see from A to B to C, and then it starts a new form with a different A. Now these sketches are what I reproduced to designate different forms of recursive operation. And the one on the middle was actually from Heidegger. Heidegger's drawing of the recursive structure of Schelling's philosophy of nature. Now, for Kant, the clearest definition of the organic form can be found in paragraph 64 of the Critique of Judgment, where he defines the organic being as following: a thing exists as a natural end if it is, through, in a double sense, both cause and effect of itself. Now we can think about this spiral structure again. Kant then provides the example of a tree, highlighting three elements that define as an organic being. It affirms two important categories of relations, namely community, Gemeinschaft, and reciprocity, Wechselwirkung. In other words, they constitute a primary form of self-organization, as Kant writes, I quote again, "Nature, on the contrary, organizes itself." And he's speaking against mechanism, speaking against machines. And thus so, in each species of its organized product, following a single pattern, certainly as to general features, but nevertheless admitting deviations calculated to secure self-preservation under particular circumstances. These two concepts, community and reciprocity, also characterize Kant's political philosophy, which we can vaguely identify with the help of Hannah Arendt in her lectures on Kant's political philosophy. What grounds this political ideal is nature, as we are told. the great artist, the eventual guarantee of perpetual peace. We recall what Kant said in the idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim that, I quote, one can regard the history of the human species in the large as the completion of a hidden plan of nature, the Vollziehung eines verborgenen Plans der Natur. If the history of the human species involves the completion of the hidden plan of nature, it is because this plan is teleological and organic, ensuring community and reciprocity through a republican constitution. Therefore, we see that Kant's notion of the organic is not only a mode of operation, but rather that which conditions all territories of philosophical thinking, political reason, aesthetic judgment, cosmopolitanism. These short excursus allows us to see how the concept of the organic, which came largely from the naturalists of the 18th century, not only provide a new form of operation and structure, but also allows philosophy to identify a new condition for itself, in other words, by rejecting the totalizing explanatory power of mechanism, especially Cartesianism, and its later dominance in industrialism. Philosophy embraces the organic. Now, these are the further developments of the question of the concept of organic after Kant, but I will not go into that. Maybe we'll come back to this later during the discussion. So now I would like to move to the second part, philosophy after cybernetics, and I chose this because I knew that I will speak together with Orit, and Orit worked a lot on cybernetics, so I hope that I can create opportunity for discussions. Again, I will start with another quote, and this quote is from Heidegger. It might very well still take a considerable time to recognize that the organism and the organic presents themselves as the mechanistic technological triumph of modality over the domain of growth nature. Now, this was written in the 1930s in the notorious Black Notebook. But where I see very clearly the Heidegger's quotes as a response to what we heard about Immanuel Kant before. Now here comes my second claim. The concept of organism is no longer able to provide philosophy with a conceptual tool to engage with technology. Therefore, the categories which philosophy or other humanities disciplines have borrowed from biology have to be rethought under the new condition. What is the status of the organic or organism today in view of the technological, in light of the technological automation, which has both becoming organic, a machine becoming organic, and we also talk about moral autonomy of machines, where you can already read very often about this in newspaper. We know that organicism as a philosophical thought informed by embryology was developed in the 20th century by various philosophers, notably Whitehead, as well as biologists who identified themselves as disciples of Whitehead, such as Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and I think Foreign worked a lot on Bertalanffy as well. Joseph Woodger and Joseph Needham, and indeed we may be able to associate different schools under the conditions of philosophizing, organicism, embryology, systems theory, Gödel's recursive function, and Turing machine, cybernetics, and so on and so forth. Organicism wants to go beyond both mechanism and vitalism, and it was a remedy to the catastrophe produced by industrialism in the 19th century. As Bertalanffy wrote in his General Systems Theory, the mechanistic, I quote here, the mechanistic worldview taken the play of physical particles as ultimate reality. And again, we are entering into dialogue with virtuality, found its expression in a civilization which glorifies physical technology that has led eventually to the catastrophe of our time. Possibly the model of the world as a great organization can help to reinforce the sense of reverence for the living, which we have almost lost in the last centenary decades of human history. So this was written in the 1930s as a critique of industrialism, as a critique of mechanization of the society. In the 18th century, the opposition between machine and organism remained conceptual. In the 19th century, the triumph of mechanism in the process of industrialization amplifies this tension and leads to a political romanticism of reconciling steel and nature, as we know very well in Germany. However, it is not still the case today. Thus, organicism necessarily stands against mechanism, as was the case in the 18th century and 19th century. In view of the triumph of industrial technologies, many critics today wanted to oppose technological development with organicism of one form or another, as if the organic is the safe backyard and as if technology that we are talking about today is just another updated form of 18th century mechanism. This critique, based on the opposition between organism and mechanism, often leads to a fantasy that aims towards a political naturalism, which sees the organic as the ideal model for art, philosophy, and politics, as it was the case for the 18th century Romantics. It becomes increasingly so with the ecological crisis today and the urgency of rethinking the coexistence of multiple species. For example, in the work of Donna Haraway, which may be read as a return of the treaties on perpetual peace, not between nation states, but between species. And I think this is the question of multiple species is also be a subject of the plural world. An unsophisticated reflection may essentially lead to a facile decision between annihilation of nature or annihilation of technology. And in order to reflect on an agenda of coexistence and plurality, we must re-examine its oppositions, organic against mechanic, political naturalism versus digital vitalism, etc. Now, let us ponder Heidegger's claim, and I want to refer here. In the Black Notebooks that we quoted earlier, what Heidegger says here is to be thought against the backdrop of mechanism and organism debate of the 18th century. Heidegger wants to point out that such an opposition between the mechanical and the organic was already obsolete. And therefore, the organic is no longer an ideal of the humanity and of perpetual peace. What made Heidegger come to this conclusion, and what does it mean for us today? We must go back to Heidegger's claim that cybernetics means both the end and the accomplishments of Western philosophy and metaphysics, where we read, I hope I did the quote, "The end of philosophy proves to be the triumph of the manipulable arrangement of a scientific technological world and of the social order proper to this world." the first meaning of the end of philosophy, cybernetics. Then he continues, the end of philosophy means the beginning of the world's civilization based upon Western European thinking. Now, the second meaning of the end of philosophy. One cybernetics, the other geopolitics. Now, besides of understanding as a claim stemming from his geopolitical and philosophical quest for the question of being, we have to align with our own inquiry concerning a new condition of philosophizing. In order to understand this claim, we must go back to cybernetics, especially Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics of Control and Communication in Man and Animal, published in 1948. Now, the first chapters of Wiener's Cybernetics was titled, and I think many people have forgotten about this title, Newtonian and Bessonian Time. The Newtonian motion is a mechanism and time symmetric, therefore reversible, whereas Bergsonian time is biological, creative, and irreversible. These differences between Newtonian time and Bergsonian time define the boundaries between physics and biology, machine and organism. The task of cybernetics was to show that with the achievements in physics, especially statistical mechanics and quantum mechanics, it is possible to employ notions such as feedback and information to construct a cybernetic machine that transgresses the boundary between machines and organism. Therefore, towards the end of the chapter, Norbert Wiener claims, and I quote, the modern automation exists in the same sort of Bergsonian time as the living organism. And hence, there is no reason in Bergson's considerations why the essential mode of functioning of the living organism should not be the same as that of the automation of this type. In fact, the whole mechanist-vitalist controversy has been relegated to the limbo of badly posed questions. Now, the overcoming of the mechanist-vitalist controversy does not mean that a machine is now vitalist, but rather that this duality has been overcome by an organization of which cybernetics is its mechanical realization. In Wiener's conceptualization, when we grasp a glass of water, for example, in front of me, and bring it towards my mouth, this involves multiple feedback loops and adjustments according to the information evaluated, which in turn measures the level of organization itself. Or in other words, Wiener is claiming that Bergson's vitalist definition of organism can no longer differentiate itself from the design of a cybernetic machine. And when you look into ChatGPT and so on, it has become very obvious today. For Wiener, the concept of feedback is not limited to technical object and organism. He also extended to economic analysis and other social phenomena. That's to say, with Norbert Wiener's formulation, one can see feedback everywhere. It constitutes a new epistemology. No, I will skip this. Now, we come to the last part, in search for new conditions of philosophizing. Cybernetics presents itself as an event in which the modern condition of philosophizing is challenged. And it is in this sense we can understand why Heidegger says that cybernetic marks the end of Western philosophy, and that it simulates on the mode of existence of technical objects. He claims that technical objects are becoming organic. The On the Mode of Existence of Technical Object was published in 1958. In the 1960s, in an article on cybernetics, I think it's called Cybernetics and Epistemology, Simondon makes the claim that Kant, only by situating in this quote, only by situating in the critique of judgment, that Kant would be able to deal with cybernetics. Now this sounds like a joke. Kant's critique of judgment, published in 1790, and cybernetics only appear in after 1943. But I think what I'm trying to make clear in the previous two sessions kind of explain the interpretation of Simondon, that only in the critique, in the third critique, that Immanuel Kant was able to deal with cybernetics. The technological development in the 20th century seems to have enforced philosophy to reorganize, to recognize another condition of being. That's to say, it is no longer based on the opposition between organic and mechanic. Hence, the question of Lebenswert also have to be challenged from this perspective. To summarize what we have discussed above and relate it back to the question of coexistence, we have been trying to show, firstly, how mechanism-organism dichotomy became the condition of modern philosophy, starting from Leibniz, but more systematically in Kant's critique of judgment. Second, how such a paradigm of thinking, which we call the organic condition of philosophizing, is surpassed today by cybernetics. And this challenge will become more and more obvious with the advancements of AI, of which the recent launch of ChatGPT has already created an existential panic. Thirdly, how proposals concerning coexistence, which based on the romantic concept of nature or the organismic concept of nature, may no longer provide us an adequate answer to the question of coexistence and also the mode of plurality. Now, in this case, we have to, firstly, to identify a new condition of philosophizing, and secondly, to develop a new framework to deal with the question of plurality and coexistence in light of the technological development. The organismic metaphor will not take us much further than what is happening today, and it might have the danger of alluring us into the biological metaphor, which no longer presents us the critical apparatus to understand the condition of philosophizing. Again, the question of Lebenswert and the continuation in Marcuse and so on. By distancing from the biological metaphor, and I emphasizing distancing instead of negating, because it still has its value, we will have to identify a new path, one that attempts radical opening. Therefore, the question of virtuality in its relation to plurality has to be grasped concretely from the perspective of epistemology and probably not ontology, which I think it was already addressed by many others in the 20th century, for example, Gilles Deleuze. A new condition of philosophizing has to be clarified, but it remains obscure to those who ignore the question of technology, especially cybernetics. And only after we have clarified such a condition of philosophizing, then can we ask where we shall begin again. Now, so far we have not resolved any problem. I only tried here to clarify the problem, which for me is a big problem and it still has to be resolved. Though I'm tempted to elaborate on my own speculation, I think time is out, and I will have to reserve it in another talk or in the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just having pointing problems. All right. So I was going to talk about, so first, thank you for that brilliant talk, Yakri. It's kind of daunting to follow up, and this is going to be on a pretty different register, but I actually think there's some serious questions that might relate between the two of them, certainly around cybernetic systems and the relationship between the organic and the mechanical, or perhaps nature and culture, depending how you see it. And so first I want to thank Florian and everybody at Virtual Worlds for bringing me here. It's really an honor, and thank you for sitting here this beautiful afternoon and listening to this. So I was going to talk about planetary intelligence originally, based on work I had done on infrastructures, large big data infrastructures in places like the Atacama Desert in Chile and the Event Horizon Telescope, but also the many extraction and materialities that underpin our virtual world. I'm not going to talk about that today because actually I wanted to think about another type of virtuality that's lately preoccupying me, which is primarily that of finance. Because if there is a world that makes and unmakes futures and that guides how we think about and speculate on and manage the future, it's the finance markets and their accompanying, insurance and other markets. So today I'm going to take a slight diversion, but it will certainly talk to the question of perhaps virtuality. And in many ways, in most of my other work, a lot about plurality, because a lot of the ideas and concepts I'm going to work in today have great bearing on also how we've come to see on a history of automating human decision-making, and ultimately its relationship to questions of things like civil rights and diverse and plural societies. And so while I'm not going to be talking about that because this is a fairly short talk today, I do want to mention that that's something I'm happy to elaborate about because the naturalization of certain ideas, and there's a real correlation here between the two talks in the sense of, for me, the neural net is an ideological but also technological and epistemological mode by which we transform both concepts of nature and society in ways that they converge between the biological and the organic, and the way that naturalize certain notions of collectivity, decision-making, agency, and with serious repercussions for the present that I want to think about. So, on that note, we're going to be in the garden of speculative delights today, and I'm going to talk a lot about financialization of cognition. And this work is grounded in a book I just released, The Smartness Mandate with Robert Mitchell. So since this is going to be a talk about capitalism, go buy it. No, just kidding. Then I'll critique it. But anyway, or find it for free somewhere. But so it's based on this, but it's also new work, so I'm hoping to kind of progress forward with it. But I'm going to open with this image because in 1997, the Securities Industry Automation Corporation, SIAC, approached the architecture firm Asymptote Architecture, Lisa Ann Couture and Hani Rashid, with a request. And they're kind of one of the leading, at the time in 97, architects thinking not only about digitality, digital methods in architecture, which had been around for a long time with CAD and other types of programs, but actually thinking what it means to produce spaces that are digital, not just made by digital tools, but actually kind of new information environments. And they wished the firm, so the New York Stock Exchange wished the firm to create a virtual trading floor, you're seeing mock-ups here, a model of representation of the New York Stock Exchange that would recreate the space of the exchange in a virtual world. For Asymptote, the commission was viewed as exciting and a possibility to experiment with their ideas of space, digital media, and cinema at scale. They'd done mostly like avant-garde little things. They were like pretty shocked that someone like New York Stock Exchange would approach them. In interviews about the project, Kutar and Rashid recalled researching images of past trading floors in New York and Chicago. So this is the New York Stock Exchange somewhere in the mid-'80s. Despite the earlier introduction of digital technologies, so you see there's lots of computers into the functioning of the market, trading was still a very physical act that took place on the floor as late as the late 1980s. Wall Street was a place, even an actual building, where the exchange existed. As they recalled, you could, and I'm quoting now, you could tell how the stock market was performing by just looking at the space, either by the amount of paper and garbage on the floor, by how fast people were moving and where they were congregated. So you could literally see market activity according to where people were running around on the exchange. Exchanges were places available to the human sensorium and physically existing in a space that arguably responded to a world outside of itself. So this was sort of a representation. But since the 1960s and particularly post-1970s, the New York Stock Exchange and virtually all other financial exchanges became not only digital, but there became a new set of financial instruments that fundamentally mandated computization, and this is the Black-Scholes options pricing equation. So it's a way of pricing the future, speaking of forms of speculation and virtuality, that I spend a lot of time thinking about. But these types of instruments, so the rise of both the dot-coms and these new electronic trading platforms, as well as these financial instruments in the 1980s and 90s, intensified the velocity and volume of trading exponentially, further making the trading floor unnecessary. As a result, the older floors of exchanges with trading posts were rapidly being phased out. And this is a contemporary trading terminal, which was in the Bloomberg trading platform, which currently was introduced in the mid-1980s, around 1983. And interestingly enough, you can see a picture of the old kind of stock market behind it, and then there's like a little sign for help. I don't know what that means, and this is like Bloomberg marketing, but anyway. So this is what most people in the world sit behind today if they're busy working in a financial firm. They're super expensive, and anyway, you can see that this sort of this new system this system had to be automated by computers. So the runners and clerks previously managing the trades, as you can see behind, sort of disappeared, and in their place came traders and quants behind these Bloomberg terminals and other electronic trading platforms that were largely flat screens with graphs and statistical information. These systems were geared towards actuarial visualization of the market, and so the effort to maintain a place for finance or a site that felt like an architectural space was sort of disappearing in the very moment that, weirdly enough, the New York Stock Exchange is like, we really have to deal with virtual, with this internet thing. The New York Stock Exchange, however, is on Wall Street. It's a legendary site for imagining economy, and the NYSE in turn sought to present a new interface and trading platform that matched the emergent digital economy. So this was commissioned right in the middle of the dot-com boom, the first one, for those of you who are old enough to remember. And this was this new virtual trading floor was going to match both this new economy and produce a new infrastructure for the internet, but one that might continue to invoke the older history of Wall Street as the world's preeminent exchange for securities. And here you're seeing some renderings of what they did. And you can see they kind of wanted to maintain the sites of the poles where each exchange existed, but at the same time you see these things moving up and down. They were trying to spatialize or somehow show the moving data, the kind of actual decisions happening on the market. It's kind of very confusing and makes no sense whatsoever. But the NYSE, so as one watches the many trailers and simulations made to model the virtual floor, one witnesses this effort to reconcile sort of a cinematic and digital perception. The pieces show a choppy amalgamation between these things and sort of first-person shooter games, establishing shots, regular fly-throughs, and tunneling. So they have all sorts of different things going on in some of the mock-ups. The project appears to vacillate between efforts to diagram and clearly represent information flow in the manner of a flowchart and the efforts to maintain sort of human sovereignty over a technical space. And here's some more of their little kind of notes to this, this exchange and how it was going to look. The project, therefore, seems to vacillate, as I mentioned, between efforts to diagram and represent information flow in a manner of a flowchart and the efforts to maintain sort of some sovereignty, like a God's eye view, if you will, over the technical space of the market. Most of the fly-throughs are Cartesian, envisioning a trader or user who stands outside the market and can see the market floor, as though that would be possible. One might read this model of the virtual trading floor as a struggle to give the concept of the market as processor of information a form. But what was Asymptote actually trying to render here? What are they trying to show? What is being modeled in these simulations? Was it how human beings make decisions? How information flows in a market? So what are we actually seeing? So there's a tension, as I mentioned, in these models between representation and interaction. On one hand, asymptote simulations appear as an effort to integrate the human sensorium into the market and to offer a cognitive perceptual landscape attuned to the imagined futures of immersive computing and ubiquitous digital media, a landscape the users do not have full information about and whose geography is not clearly demarcated and located. So one might say this is a model of an exchange as one kind of comprised by many agents networked together in sort of a self-organizing or decentralized system. That impulse, however, to kind of show this kind of fluctuating information-driven networked market competes with other visualizations like the one you're looking at that attempted to actually show things like heat maps. So the idea was that you'd see which exchange was doing the most activity through how warm it was, which is kind of prophetic in an age of Bitcoin. So this sort of offers us this idea of kind of still being able to map and fully understand where action is happening in a market. Is sort of an older concept of liberal individuals still making reasoned decisions on full information. This full information correlated with the desire to map or spatialize the exchange in a manner amenable, as I mentioned, to individual human apprehension and conception. This space, which was also one for timing bets, was always mediating, therefore, between the quote-unquote real and virtual, as well as the present, past data, and the future timing of speculation. So we have a temporal question here, right? Because everyone's making bets on the future. They're shorting it. The only physical part of the model that they built was a room that was to be used for television coverage of the exchange. The space was used by the new cable news network, or CNN. You're now probably all really familiar, but literally it launched its, so there's a new media infrastructure of all-time, real-time news coming into being with this new architecture of the market at the exact same time. Today, CNN might seem dated, but in 1997, it was a hot thing. That's how far we're coming, how quickly. Ultimately, and reading anachronistically, I could argue that these representations were therefore not about representing or modeling a market, rather they can be read to be training grounds for actually getting us used to being immersed in information, sort of for integrating human users into the market as part of a network game or organization with information that can be modified, perhaps even mutated. You can see this kind of moving information at will. Traders, and perhaps also the viewers of the television market data on CNN, were given a recognizable representation of the space they had known and been in, so this is sort of recognizable to us today, offering an impression that the market information they were being given was complete and suitable to make grounded, reasoned decisions, but the Cartesian perspective was only a conduit to be channeled into immersion in the exchange or into the constant stream of cable network news and later the internet. The final models of the trading floor do not offer a very clear view of anything. One struggles to understand where actually economic activity is happening here. In fact, I'm struggling to even read this rendering. The traders in themselves are sort of part of the data of the system. It is perhaps telling that neoliberal economic theorists also no longer viewed markets as representing information, but as processing it. As Milton Friedman, the Chicago School economist and leading neoliberal, is famously paraphrased as remarking, economic theories are engines or machines, not cameras. They don't represent the world, they make it. So markets are made through models that do not show an existing market, but actually make a new one. And in many ways, it seems like these efforts to kind of create a virtual trading store kind of struggle with this question of what a model is, even in their own models of this market, in the sense of you're kind of creating this new virtual space and this new form of information economy as you're sort of depicting it. And that's kind of something we've all known for a long time, but this seems to take it to a new level of materialization and intensification in ways that I think deserve to be thought about. The fact that the market is increasingly seen as replacing human-centered agency through the manipulation of information seems to be additionally supported by the fact that in all the simulations of the trading floor, there's never any human beings. So while the archive to the project contains images like this of sort of Bill Clinton visiting the New York Stock Exchange, and politicians, celebrities, and executives all engaging in seemingly intimate exchanges, the actual sort of way it was rendered, the human doesn't show up except in the video feeds or the kind of images of the CNN prompter within this space. In the models for the project, they only appear, as I mentioned, like this. The market implicitly modeled was one of disembodied networked intelligence, culling data from elsewhere and somehow autonomously making decisions. The viewer is interpolating this scene as a consumer or perhaps trainee of the intelligence. The interface is about learning how to mine the data of the exchange and move it around, and the screens are less about representing information for analysis than teaching users how to interact with this informatic landscape. Asymptote's problems with modeling and exchange only refracted a long-running tenet of neoliberal economics and finance. Mainly, the markets cannot be perfectly represented, and therefore the prediction and planning is impossible or unnecessary. Since the 1960s, when the first computerized trading desks that look kind of like this were added to the New York Stock Exchange, computing was understood by both managers and regulators as being algorithmic and rule-bound. The hope was that the more automated the market, the more rule-bound it would become. So people inside the financial services were like, yes, we'll add computers and then we won't need laws because, you know, computers follow laws, right? They're very protocol-driven. So they were kind of hoping that it would save the New York Stock Exchange from regulation. And in fact, while there is plenty of regulation in the financial industries, the one thing that's not regulated is the actual technology. And so, for example, that's why you can lay down a fiber optic cable and make like 10 times more money than any private investor, because no one actually, because they're still treating it like every bet's coming in on time, and that those computerized systems and those infrastructures don't make a difference, but they do quite exponentially. So, you know, we don't actually regulate things like the time of bets or make allowances for the infrastructures that actually carry this information, and that's a pretty big deal actually in terms of social equity. So the hope was that the more automated the market, the more rule-bound it would become, the less regulation. So NYSE managers wanted more computers on the floor to manage and monitor, but they also wanted more computers on the floor to manage and monitor labor, particularly the lower-paid clerical work. So here you see a woman at a brokerage terminal in the 70s using these ticker machines. So a lot of the labor of actually entering the calls was relegated to kind of lower class and often gendered laborers that, of course, managers sought either more surveillance over or perhaps elimination of. So increased trading values forced these clerks to fall behind the transaction tape. So with the dot-com and with the emergence of things like Charles Schwab and consumer trading on these platforms, the volume simply of trading went up so high that human beings really couldn't enter the prices fast enough. So they forced clerks to fall behind the transaction tapes and often to to enter specific prices and transactions at a particular time. Human error and slowness was seen as untenable, but also as non-transparent, kind of arbitrary in assigning prices and so forth. So industry and government officials also thought computing would save the securities industry from regulation, as I mentioned. If computers follow the rules algorithmically, there's no need for oversight. The fantasy of automated markets was therefore also a fantasy of deregulation, which comes in tandem. The concept that machines might make markets and evade governance came also from a longer neoliberal tradition that reimagined human intelligence as machinic and network. So one of the things I'm trying to do here is to talk about this kind of very specific history within a broader intellectual history of how we've come to understand intelligence as fundamentally networked. And self-organizing. So individuals that only markets, and that part of the thing that kind of complements our contemporary artificial intelligence discourses is the discourse that came before AI, which is that only markets make informed decisions. Okay, so markets in some sense can always do what human beings could not do. As Friedrich Hayek already announced in 1945 at the kind of start of contemporary neoliberal thought, the problem of a rational economic order is a problem of knowledge that never exists. The economic problem of society is a problem set by data, is a question of data, and it's a problem of a utilization of knowledge not given to anyone in its totality. So only markets, Hayek argued, can make decisions at scale. Each of us is subjective, fundamentally irrational, and unable to make decisions. Only markets agglomerate many human beings' decision makings and allocate resources or decide prices correctly, according to Hayek, or can do that. So only some sort of networked intelligence of many individuals making small decisions can lead to making the right decision or creating perhaps truths, if we will. And I've done considerable work on this, but really quickly what I want to highlight about this statement that's quite famous is that, of course, it signifies the emergence of a couple conceptualizations, or perhaps we might call epistemologies of the information economy that have emerged. And I would say Hayek was, of course, very prominent in saying this, but hardly alone, okay? One, that markets about coordinating information and not matching supply and demand. Remember, the economic problem is one of data. And that's something Philip Mirowski has done a lot of excellent work on. Second, the fundamental model here, and this is my critical point and something I try to trace in my other work, is this idea that there's kind of a virtue to network decision-making. So the model of learning and using knowledge being posited in Hayek's account is grounded in the idea of a networked intelligence embodied in the market. And three, we might think of this as a kind of environmental intelligence. Markets can allow the creation of knowledge outside of and beyond the purview of individual humans. So markets know what we do not know. Just like today, perhaps we think of artificial intelligence or often discursively render it. This is a notion of cognition and decision-making dispersed into the world and possessed by entities outside of the human. Of course, one of the things that's really interesting, of course, is that this was a series of models that also fed back to other sciences like psychology and artificial intelligence. And Hayek's ideas of intelligence would develop in tandem with the ideas of people like Donald O. Hebb, a Canadian psychologist who first came up with the idea that cells or neurons that wire together fire together. And the idea there is that in my mind, I don't store every image I see of every face I see. I store, basically, certain triggers will set off a path of neurons, and the more I see that trigger, the more that neuron is conditioned to fire. So for example, we don't tell babies what a cat is. Baby sees the cat many times, and eventually, after a lot of a certain set of neurons start firing, and every time a baby sees the cat, those neurons will fire, and they get more and more conditioned. So there's a statistical feature that the neurons are learning, and the more cats they see, the more they're likely to fire together. If this sounds super, super familiar, that's because this is the model that was the first model for neural networks that still, in many ways, is part of the contemporary notion of learning that is possessed in neural networks. And he, of course, got these ideas from working on soldiers and other people who had lost limbs or certain other capacities, and he was really interested in how brains rewired or learned to compensate. He also was really interested in sensory deprivation and boredom as a kind of condition of work, and so these are the famous sensory deprivation studies that Naomi Klein mentions in the shock doctrine, where essentially people realized that you could program brains remotely through the environment through these studies. So this was a really critical model that then went on to impact Hayek's work in the sensory order. And one of the things I really want to emphasize is that the idea of intelligence coming out of, and decision-making and agency coming out of both Hayek's work and psychologists like Donald Hebb at the time, has things that are similar but very different than for example, Cold War rationality depicted by Daston and other people of Cold War. So it's important to note that this is not the rationality of the Cold War Rand expert. These are not informed analysts making expert decisions, but rather a networked intelligence fundamentally grounded in a whole lot of subjective, ignorant, non-conscious decisions. So the really important thing is that these are ideas of systems and models of learning in the mind and of the human that can fundamentally learn without consciousness, and most importantly for neoliberal economists, of course, there can be a self-organizing system without planning or having to represent the system ahead of time. So that's a really critical feature. And along with this, number 4 is a reconceptualization of freedom itself. So it is a problem of the utilization of knowledge not given to anyone in its totality. So Hayek begins his long route to re-script that to be free is to be free to take part of a network, or in this case, a market. And in fact, this kind of valorization, both of this form of freedom, or called liberty, as kind of the only type of liberty or freedom that the state should be worried about guaranteeing you, combined with a kind of valorization, right, of a sort of non-conscious decision-making, is a fairly profound transformation in our ideals of both democracy and economy. And one of Hayek's most favorite citations that he constantly repeated was this one by Alfred Whitehead, which is, "It is profoundly erroneous truism that we should cultivate the habit of thinking." Don't do it too much. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations we can perform without thinking about them. So the less thought, the better. We're actually progressing. The less you think, the more automated systems take care of it. There you are. That's the thing. And so for asymptote, of course, the seeming so this therefore becomes this sort of new relationship where our brains, our minds, and our economies are all hooked together. And perhaps, and here's just a trading app that kind of demonstrates the level to which our very nervous systems are today kind of integrated into markets and our constant trading, or at least many people's trading. It is perhaps then no surprise that these ideas also informed the actual advent of the neural net. And here's Frank Rosenblatt in 1960. And Rosenblatt, he developed the first kind of statistical learning with layers, says as inspiration, a small number of people, Hebb, Hayek, Aklas, have attempted to integrate specific ideas, and that it is their descriptive models which suggest the possible principles of organization for the future of machine learning. And indeed, the innovation was that statistical learning and nets. Which brings us back to asymptote to end. For asymptote, the seeming immateriality of the space of speculation drove the designers, however, to take a different route. So if computer scientists, psychologists, economists were obsessed with these new model of networked intelligence making as the route to freedom and indeed progress, or whatever that is for society, a society that now should think less. For asymptote, they had a surprising turn at the end where they mentioned that while the New York Stock Exchange talked all sorts about numbers and quants and things like that, for them, the seeming immateriality of this space of speculation drove the designers to take inspiration from stories of divinity. The architects mentioned that it was not the explanations of executives at the New York Stock Exchange or SIAC that inspired them. Rather, it was Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights and Dante's Inferno. There's heaven, hell, and purgatory in a market, asymptote argued, with the exchange itself being a sort of giant churning sea, and I'm quoting them, of hoarding and wasting. It appeared as though information was flowing and assets were exchanged with seemingly no hands, pure invisible guidance, perhaps the very final realization of Adam Smith's original vision of the invisible hand and the market as extensions of divinity. And so there's a really interesting question, of course, within this history of networked intelligence and markets making decision that kind of stretches into the 18th century and earlier in terms of the invisible hand. So while a model of exchange of waste, excess, and information was not how the project was framed, at least not by the New York Stock Exchange, it's prophetic, of course, in an age of trading apps where finance is democratized and YOLing and hodling with options and global macro hedges are standard practice. So money today can, of course, be lost and made from literally burning just energy, the seeming inversion of the very idea of efficiency in modern thermodynamics, and it posits us to think about questions of noise in the system, where noise is actually the source of value. This early vision of the world as financial interface, therefore, appears to anticipate but also separate in critical ways from the colorful trading apps of NFTs, Robinhoods, crypto exchanges that populate our present. I open with the story of the first three-dimensionally digitally modeled virtual trading floor interface because it makes visible a new relationship between computing, ideas of networked intelligence, and finance. If architects fell to images of theology and divination in an effort to show what to them was ineffable, mainly the New York Stock Exchange, their inability to model and spatialize finance only reflected and refracted a more fundamental transformation in the histories of intelligence, computing, and modeling. How have we come to see both digital machines and human agents as networked intelligence and part of self-organizing systems that can never truly be planned or predicted? Perhaps a new vision of post-history where humans do not even control these networks, they're absolutely absent everywhere. It's perhaps telling that in the end, the current interfaces that we deal with to the market are no longer spatialized or attempt to create set coordinates in time and space for the people using them, but rather sort of give us this new kind of actuarial, logistical vision of the world. And these questions that I'm asking are, of course, not innocent. They've shaped neoconservative and neoliberal thinking for the past 4 decades, but they've also shaped our artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. I'm labeling this sort of phenomena the financialization of cognition, the production of a literally attentive economy through new media that mirrors a reconfiguration of human agency and decision-making that reflects and refracts contemporary notions of digital economy and finance. These designs implicitly assume cognition and perception as programmable, networked, and collaborative or collective. Architecture, in this case, is participating in building an ideal of networked intelligence that made machine learning and economic decision-making commensurate and part of the same system. So we have become attuned to this model of the world where our machines and our markets and our personal decisions and decision-making are syncopated. The future, I argue, lies in recognizing, however, perhaps what our machines have finally made visible, what has perhaps always been there, mainly the socio-political nature of our seemingly natural thoughts and perceptions. So again, this idea of the networked market allows a kind of collapse, I guess, between our naturalization of these technical systems in a way that makes unquestionable the sort of precarities they produce and violences they produce. This possibility haunts the visual trading floor's leftover remains. So this is a project that saw its realization almost at the moment of the dot-com collapse, and whose utility was never clear, so this wasn't really ever a system that was used. These failures, I argue, make evident something about the social constructedness and the work, aesthetic, political, and economic, to maintain our belief in both markets and now artificial intelligence as forces of nature or divinity. Every market crash, every subprime mortgage event also makes possible to recognize how our machines have linked so many of us together in precarity. And of course, with the rise of these changes, there's been enormous transformations in allocation of wealth distribution, and actually most of it coming from 2001 onwards. So financialization is something that has massively grown, particularly post-2001. So this relation is only made visible if it's not aesthetically smoothed over through media and narratives of inevitability. Something that, of course, is the work of critique, and I'm assuming the work of centers such as the one I'm speaking to now. So the potential politics of these moments has yet to be fully realized, but it's one that we need to activate. And so as a final thought, I just fall to thinking about the potential that kind of these market crashes and moments of extreme networking also allow us to see how interconnected we are through our financial and digital infrastructures. These are the Chilean anti-austerity protests that broke out in 2019. There's a lot more I could say about it, but they are sort of an exemplar of, and they started a new process of constitutional reform that unfortunately has not fully succeeded, but at least is maybe something that we can think with, in the way that that machine systems also allow new forms of politics, collectivity, and even constitutional and forms of new relations to emerge. And that all computer systems are programmed and therefore planned. We're also forced to contend with the intentional and therefore changeable nature of how we both think and perceive our world. So in thinking about these failed models of markets, we also see the traces and the remnants of the fact that our contemporary networked world is not only one that actually exists and has to exist, but one that was imagined and created. So thank you. I'll leave it there, and thanks.